Sparkademy, which is the latest venture founded. Actually, we were founded officially in March 2020. So that's like a really, really good year to start a company. But we basically grew exponentially from then. We actually started working on this in 2017, but I'll more about that later. And we call ourselves a digital first institution. Why? Because we believe that a lot of the reasons why we need to work a lot with digitalization today is that although computers have been around since the 70s, 60s, let's say in banking, for example, since the 70s, we were computerizing the processes and the things that we had before. We were not really digitalizing, which makes now these whole legacy systems, and it's been really, really difficult. So if you're going to design something from scratch with the tools of today, how is that going to look like? And that's where your journey has to start. How do you start from zero, from the ground up to build, given the environment, the context, and the tools that we have today? That's what we've tried to do. And I think that's the mindset you need to take to your organization. So today we're talking about these future skills, and there's a short answer and a long answer to this. But I think the hardest part is not what those skills are, but how do we close that skill gap? How we bring these people kind of to where we need them to be. Now, just again, short about myself, Rocky did a great job on introducing. But in short, I'm in background engineering, then went into kind of corporate innovation, did a PhD, and started a couple of different companies along the way. My passion is education. I've been teaching since I'm 15 years old. I've taught everything from children to adults who couldn't read, and a couple of different universities around the world. And one interesting insight that I've gained from teaching all these years is that, let's say, the interest, the motivation, the attention span, the style of the students that I get today for the same class that I did 10 years ago has changed dramatically. Also, the toppings on pizzas, by the way. Now half my pizzas have to be vegan and vegetarian. 10 years ago, it was like one vegetarian per 9 salami. So again, very, very interesting thing to see how that's changed so dramatically over the last few years. And again, that's something that, again, why I highlight that is because the change is real, the change is here. If you need to keep your hand on the pulse of time, and I think that's important. And I just wanted to mention a bit about my co-founder, Stefan, who's a professor at ETH Zurich, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And main reason I want to highlight his work is we started working together because his research consisted of putting successful entrepreneurs, people who had sold their companies for millions, as well as top managers at engineering firms such as ABB, Siemens, GE, into fMRI machines and have them do certain tasks while they were in there. They were scanning their brains as they were doing certain tasks. And he mapped out a certain number of parameters in the brain that help define innovativeness for an individual within a spectrum. Now, the most interesting part of that research is that the, let's say, parts of the brain that are the most responsible for innovativeness are neuroplastic parts of the brain. So, in theory, we could all be very strong and fit if we all went to the gym every day, right? Whether we decide to do so or not, and we're in a context that allows us to do so, by the way, which is context matters, and context is very important. But the possibility is there. Now, of course, some of us have a better predisposition towards that than others. My wife loves it. Me, not so much. But again, we could all do that. And I think that's really, really interesting because it talks about personal development. And that's what we're aiming for here. People need to want to personally develop. So that's how we started kind of working together, and those are the insights on which we build a lot of our work. Now, let's go into innovativeness. And again, most of my work has been around innovation in the last years, and now we talk about these future skills. But I like showing this picture as to showcase why we need these future skills, these people skills that we're talking about. So for innovation, we always talk about this famous Venn diagram where we say, okay, in order to reach this pinnacle of innovation, we need to think about human desirability. Does someone actually want it? Does someone actually need it? Number two, can we actually sustainably produce and offer this towards a market whereby there's some sort of business around something that can actually sustain itself? And number three, is the technology available to produce it? In all the years that I work in corporate innovation, I've never come up with an idea where you couldn't feasibly produce it. Sorry to say, they're not that creative to come up with time travel or teleportation yet. So usually everybody focuses on this bubble, This is the least important bubble. You need to figure out, can you actually produce this sustainably, and does anybody actually want it? So that's what we always say, let's start here and move around. Now, why this Venn diagram is important in my mind is, again, the key question of this webinar is, what are the skills of the future? And in my mind, and based on the research that we've done, the skills in the future are those that are needed, not for individual parts of this bubble necessarily, but for the intersections. It's at the intersections, and maybe not like the middle part, but at the intersection between, feasibility and viability. And the intersection, those intersections, bridging those sides is what's actually hard, and what computers cannot do and will not be able to do for a foreseeable future. So it's up to us as humans, as people, to be able to bridge those gaps. And those are kind of the essential skills that we're looking for. So out of the big question of what are the skills of the future, Rocky mentioned at the beginning, the World Economic Forum mentions these as kind of what are the key things that we really need to work on. There's a lot of text around here, but if you look at those bubbles, every single company I've ever worked for, and I'm sure all of your companies have one version of that into their strategy. I mean, UBS today published, we're going to be agile organization. Every company is talking about these things. Are they actually doing it? It's a whole different story. But the bubbles around, you're very familiar. Now, what do we need to get those bubbles? Well, that's the text in the middle. We need that, critical thinking. What's critical thinking? That's a different story. Or, active learning. How do we get our people to keep on learning? Complex problem solving, connecting the dots between different, all these are the hard things. And actually, these are extremely human skills. And that's the interesting part with digitalization. Digitalization is not about, let's all learn about blockchain or IoT. No, it's, can we actually come up with these type of skills that help us connect those dots? So those are the skills which we think are really, really essential, which make us irreplaceable within the workforce and by machines, because this is not something we're going to replace anytime soon. And how do we actually kind of keep on pushing this in the organization, keep people motivated? The problem is these are really, really hard to teach. Generally, raise a hand who's ever done a course on leadership, which was great, and that 5 years later you actually remember whatever it is you learned. So these things are hard. As such, honestly, corporate education kind of sucks. And the kind is being quite generous here. Companies are spending tons of money, millions over millions over millions. The market for corporate education is huge. CEOs will tell you, we're spending a lot of money on corporate education today. The question is anybody actually learning something? Well, number one, your employees don't seem to think so. And we narrow it down to a couple of different things. Why? It's mostly because it has to be generic, so kind of all this online learning. I can tell you, I've been teaching for years, and I'm sitting right now talking to 20 people. I have no clue if I've lost you, if I've engaged you, if Kate is actually doing something else. Or it's really, really hard to do this digitally and keep it engaged, etc. And then you need to do it for the entire organization, for finance, for operations, for marketing, and you need to make sure that anybody. Again, these things are hard, guys. So that's let's say the challenge and the area of opportunity. Now, question is, why is all this future proofing? Why is all this human skills really, really important? And we have like one simple graph, which I think is, in my mind, it's mind blowing. It came out of IBM a couple of years ago, which is basically how much knowledge we are producing over time. Okay, so I talked a lot about connecting the dots earlier and bridging between those bubbles. The bridging between those bubbles can be between two different disciplines or can be different areas, but the amount of knowledge we're generating is enormous. More and more and more. We do not have the mental capacity to connect those dots fast enough. We're being swamped, basically, and it's only getting faster. So we do not need to invest in a lot of, okay, let's train everybody on blockchain. Let's try to figure out, okay, they understand the basics. How are we going to use that to change our process? How are we going to use this to kind of make people more effective in their work? How are we going to use it to make people happier? I don't know. I don't have the answers to that. But those are the questions that your experts at your organization may or could or should be working on to try to figure out, because we have all this knowledge coming together. Now, again, if we talk about this industry 4.0, which I mentioned, again, most people focus on these tech skills. And again, whenever somebody feels like the skills of the future, most of you are thinking left box. And sure, yes, but in reality, 5 years from now, this will be irrelevant. 5 years ago, everybody needs to, code in Java. Now, okay, it moves too fast. It doesn't matter. The question is, can you actually use that on the other box? Basically, again, can we apply it? Can we create innovations with it? Can we find ways of bridging customer needs towards organizational opportunities and new technologies? That cycle is what's actually going to get us basically ahead. However, we're not doing a very good job at teaching those human skills. We never have, to be honest. It's been, for all of humanity, we've mostly focused on the tech skills because those are, again, more measurable. It's clear to understand. Did you learn it? Okay, go do it. The human skills have always been some kind of this fluffy, far away thing that kind of floats around. And somehow, after 15 years of being a programmer, now you can manage programmers because now you're a manager. Congratulations. Did anybody ever teach you anything about that? No, but you've been long enough to figure it out. This is actually causing a lot more trouble because the rate of change, the rate of information that we're getting, if we don't develop these skills, it's harder and harder for us to be able to kind of keep up with this entire cycle. So the question here really is, how do we make the teaching of these human skills effective? How do we actually help, number one, identify, and then number two, really create an environment where these skills are constantly learned by our organization, by our people. Okay, so let's talk about learning effectiveness. And for us, that's kind of the number one thing. That's our main vision. How can we make learning more effective? Because today, learning is the most, I won't say efficient because it's not about time. It's the most ineffective experience that we can have. Going to university for 4 years. Who came up with 4 years, by the way? Anybody have a clue? But we've been doing it for decades, right? Who came up with these time spans? How can we come up with more effective learning? Now, there's something called Bloom's taxonomy, which any of you who's in learning are probably very familiar with this. And this is kind of the 101 of learning theory. And essentially, there's different layers in learning, going from you being able to actually remember a certain concept. Remembering doesn't mean you actually understand it, by the way. The same thing. Can you actually apply this concept? Can you analyze it? Can you evaluate? And can you create? When we think about people going through a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in theory, when you get to a PhD, you're able to create new concepts and come up with new theories, etc. But this doesn't have to happen over big chunks of university. This happens all the time with tiny concepts as, do you remember what an interview is for? Do you understand why an interview is important? Can you actually do interviews? Can you analyze the data that comes out of an interview? Can you evaluate a good interview versus a bad interview? And can you come up with a script and create a series of questions for an interview? Okay, so taking it down, it's not about university and these big untouchable things. I'm talking a very, very key skill, which is, can you actually interview someone? Okay, so if we think about learning in these layers, it's like, what do we want people to know? How much do they need to know? And how much do we need them to get all the way to the top? In some cases, we don't need them to. But again, and what skills are we trying to teach, basically? Now, if you go for the first, basically, two boxes in this pyramid, in the good old days, we had classrooms. And we'd all sit there with some person in front going through slides or some other form of visual presentation. And basically, this was the starting point of us actually remembering and understanding certain concepts. Okay? This is generally quite easy to replicate in the digital world or even in a work setting because you're actually just doing it. And today we have videos, we have multiple choice questionnaires, we have all sorts of things that actually even make this more effective online than it ever was in person in these huge groups, unless you had a smaller group. Then for the top part of the pyramid, which I think that's kind of starts getting interesting, especially for these human skills we were talking about before, the business school. The concept of the business school for us, it feels like, oh yeah, business schools have been there forever, but actually it's relatively new. Business schools have been around for no more than 60, 70 years. Okay. And the whole idea was, okay, case-based learning. So I give people a scenario, they sit down and you give them certain frameworks and stuff, and they sit down and try to solve this scenario based on these frameworks and come up, ideate new types of solutions and what could happen. And there's no one clear answer for it. Okay. So again, this is the basis of how the business school was created. And the whole idea was you could evaluate it, you could potentially create new solutions towards a scenario. So you are the CEO of this company, which has operations X and Y. So this was essentially how we took that basic remembering understanding and put it into practice. Still theoretical, but that's how we were learning in business school. And again, it's been very effective over the years. How we do it now digitally, which is actually hard, because the hard part is how do you do that at scale? In business school, I mean, Harvard Business School has 90 basically people coming in through business school every year. So again, you can't just create this ginormously. And one of the key things about this type of learning is you need feedback. You need constant feedback. You're reworking on the case, the professor would come around and you discuss, you'd ask questions. Again, he'd probe. So how do you do this at scale? Digitally, it's quite hard. And that's a part of the things we've been working at Spark Academy. How do we create different tools and different ways in which actually people can get these types of exercises, constantly get feedback, and work in teams to solve these cases and be graded at scale all over the world? And that's the hard part. And we're only at the beginnings of this. We don't understand enough of it yet. But that's what the difference between taking a course at Coursera and taking a course in a business school. The content is exactly the same, guys. The difference is the people around you and the professor being able to answer your questions right away, the environment, a lot of different aspects that make that, and we're going to go into what makes the education interesting. We haven't been able to replicate that entirely yet. We're working on that, and I think that's really, really important. Now, what does all of this mean? So there's two ways of basically helping your company really go through this kind of change management, getting them to be a learning organization. We talk about nature's approach, and a gardener will tell you can't make grass grow by pulling it. It just takes time, and you need to set the right conditions, and you let it basically you let it go. Assuming you have the right conditions, assuming you know what those conditions are and the right people, it's a complex system. A company is a complex system. The second thing is, can you actually design it in a way? Can you actually create certain values, certain mechanisms, certain processes that allow you to get there? Now, again, just because you put in a strategy, certain values, and you say, okay, we're going to be agile today, like UBS, does that actually mean you're going to, let's see, what has been put in place for that? But the number one way of which you can design this is by creating specific experiences for people to live by every day. Now, what we've learned, what we realized is that number one, we need to be customer-centric, user-centric. Learning needs to be about the individual. Number one, foremost, it's about the person. You cannot start thinking of organizational learning thinking of the organization. Start with the people. Who is it that we're teaching? Is this person motivated to learn? Can this person track their progress? If we do not track our progress, if we do not feel that we're progressing, the motivation doesn't continue. We need to, and again, we have workers' counts, we have all sorts of different laws and situations in different parts of the world, which prevent us from measuring. But actually, people want to see progress for themselves. Number three, does this feel that it's for me? Does this help me? Or is this some other excuse to help the organization? And finally, can I do this with others? Is this part of a whole? Is this part of a bigger? We want to be part of a bigger thing. That's a basic human need. Hence, religions are so popular. We want to be part of something bigger. A football club, a religion, an organization, whatever it is. But we like belonging. We'd like to know how can we contribute. And if you keep on working on these specific elements, you might create a learning journey where the person actually knows what he or she is contributing and where is this going and what for. Why am I doing this? Now, from an organizational standpoint, the way we look at it is there's an organization as a whole. Every organization, then you start breaking it down into pieces. What's the key mindset that we want to foster? And how do we foster that mindset? So make sure that everybody knows the basics. It's really, really, really hard to build a house without foundations. Okay, so we need people to actually know the basics of what's the mindset we're looking for, how are we supposed to work, what does this mean? There's going to be another layer of people who will be even more engaged, who actually find this even more interesting. That's what we call the catalysts. We have, this is for our own program, we have two different layers for catalysts. We call it core and advanced. And the idea is these people are people who actually want to work in these different ways. They want to explore. They already have, I talked about Stefano's research before, being in the gym. These people are already they like sports. they want to go there. Those are the ones that kind of you start with. Later on, you might convince the rest of them. But these people are the ones, you're front runners, basically. And they're going to have people who will be super, super into this. People who are going to think like, this is the way of the future. This is totally what I want to do. And I want to help others as well. This is what we call the leads. These are the people who are super deep and also help you spread throughout. So again, you need to think about this as top down, but also bottom up. And who are all these individuals and can we create a specific learning experience for them? I'm going to stop right there. I've talked now for 26 minutes. We were talking about timing before we're rocky. But again, I wanted you to keep these different elements in mind. Number one is these people skills, these human skills are the number one thing that we need to work on. Number two, we really need to be about the individual and how does he or she basically develop. And number three, what's the most effective way of them developing that? And then comes the organization. But all those things fit into the organization, which is this. So that's me. I'll stop right there and I'll let you guys shoot.
All right. So we'll leave up your that last page up. Oh, you can take it down. We'll make sure everyone has your contact information as well. But so yeah, let's get to questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask, or just throw them into chat, and I'm happy to ask them for you. Frank, I know you had a question. Did you want to ask that directly?
Yes, I was
human skills.
Curious about more specific details around human skills. What can you give some examples of what that means?
Yeah, for us, what we call human skills or people skills or behavioral skills, and these are all words to beat around the bush and not call them soft skills, because we hate the term soft skills because they're not soft. They're really freaking hard, but it's basically what would you consider soft skills, and it's again, leadership, creativity, team dynamics, customer engagement, experimentation, again, analytical thinking. We have a long list of these different. Can you actually moderate a meeting, a workshop? These are all what we consider to be people skills or human skills, which we actually learn more and more when we practice, and which is what makes it really hard with digital, by the way. Because again, just hearing about it online, watching a video is not going to help you practice, right? And then if you practice and there's nobody to give you feedback, then it becomes really, really hard to know if you did it right or wrong. So again, that's what we call.
I was thinking about these connecting skills, and as you were talking about these connecting these circles, I was thinking about, in the past years, we've seen fantastic social media develop, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And it seems to me they're fantastic connectors, but also it seems to me it's just not enough. And that led my mind onto Buurtzorg in Holland, where, as I understand, it's a home care organization. They have as a goal that they want to sort of connect people in the neighborhood so they can help each other. What are your thoughts about that? I'm seeing, I don't know why, but it's sort of like we have a challenge as a species to
engage,
help each other in different situations, although there's a need. I don't know. I see many large organizations basically in their DNA, they're not inclusive. They are actually exclusive. There's competition in there, and it's basically not made for people, but for machines, right? And what are your thoughts about these connecting competencies?
It's been decades of over optimization and
exactly
individualism focused basically progression. But that's basically been the last 30, 40 years of progress, which has gotten us to the shit show where we are today. And there's some good things about it too, by the way. Again, there's nothing wrong with, quality control and total quality management have done wonders to make all our lives safer, by the way. And production. So again, that's a different story. I think it's a pendulum of different. We went too far. Yeah. And it's the kind of the McKinseys of the world that tell the bank out like, oh, you should charge your employees for coffee because you would save yourself X amount of millions a year. Are you freaking kidding me? You're a bank. These type of things that have led us to this extreme, and there's been a crisis, and there's a lot of context around that. Same for the neighborhood context. I mentioned at the very beginning, context is the number one predictor of success. Now, how do you create the context for change and for innovation, et cetera? How do you create the context that actually allows for people to feel safe enough to share, to connect? And when I mean safe is a big word. But again, emotionally safe. How do you feel like you're not putting yourself in some sort of risk? We're super risk averse. We're afraid of failing. I've worked with companies where we would work on something and the results were clear. Hey, this is not going to fly. We need to kill it. And we're going to save ourselves X amount of money, which is already great. And people were terrified of presenting that to management. Because failure is not an option. So again, all these different things, but it's years. But I've also seen that change. I've seen organizations change. Someone asked about use cases. I think Elko mentioned use cases. And we started this whole thing in 2017, actually, with a consumer goods company here in Switzerland, headquartered in Switzerland, but it's a global company. And when I started working with them in 2015, these were the most individualistic, risk-fearing. Everything had to go to legal 15 times. This is like the mindset was like, oh, legal doesn't do this. Oh, legal doesn't let us do that. And I've seen that change over years, 3-4 years, which seems like a lot, but actually, if you think about it, it's not very. But you need to create that culture and let it simmer. Now, in our mind, and that's why when we have these bubbles that we talked about, the catalysts, you need to find your catalysts.
Yep.
The challenge is, how do you find them? How do you make sure these people are there for the right motivation, for the right reason, with the right mindset? And once you've got those changes, like a customer adoption curve, you've got your first movers, your super excited people, and then you've got a chasm, and then the rest of the organization, right? How do you get them to go from these super excited catalysts, change makers, yay, to move over? You need to be able to empower them to actually be the ones that get the other people excited. Because I can come up with 100 different examples for you guys. If you're not able to connect the dots yourself, I can't do it for you. And again, I have examples. Again, I work in innovation. So I've had examples where I'm sitting with a board of some, like an insurance company, a bank or whatever, and I'm presenting a case and like, yeah, but this is not about asset management. No, it's not about asset management. But again, connect the dots. It could be a asset management. This is a similar business model, but you need to spoon feed it to them. Because again, they don't have the right mindset, but there's some other people that will get it. And until those people start showing some results and those people start actually using those learnings and applying them in that context, then those people with limited imagination will be like, okay, yeah, that actually could work. Okay, maybe I'm interested. So that's how you break that chasm. You need to start low-hanging fruit, little changes in the same context to start getting them rolling. But I've taken too much time on that. Sorry, Rocky.
Well, no, that's, so let's unpack that just a little bit more, because there's a lot of theory there. And you said, like you said, you're so experienced with corporate innovation. You talked about failing fast and getting people to learn that. Can you share some examples of how, because these are all innovators on this call, how have you seen the democratization of innovation work? So how do we get other people across the organization innovating? What are your experiences there?
So democratization of innovation is hard because it's mostly done on your free time, by the way. I've rarely ever seen an actual innovation happen in a corporate where people were not volunteering for it. Okay. What do I mean with this? I was working at Allianz, the insurance company, right? my number one innovation there was actually had to do with treasury. I don't know anything about finance, guys. I don't know anything about treasury. But the number thing we built was a tool that helped us do cross-border transactions, money, like big chunks of money moving around the world. So that was number one innovation that we provided by there. My job was not to come up with some concept for treasury, but I found the global head of treasury, who was the most interesting, most excited guy. I found a lawyer who was phenomenal. And I found a couple of other key individuals throughout the organization, from operations, from legal, who were actually interested and willing to work together and put in some time and create and build bridges. My job was to build those bridges, to bring these people together and keep them rolling, right? Align them and keep them rolling. My job was not to learn about treasury. And I know a lot more about treasury than I wish I did, by the way. But again, that's not my job. And as an innovator, it's impossible for me to figure out all those different things. How could I empower those people? So now the question then is, how am I going to find a bunch of those people? Well, the honest answer is no, I'm not. Because again, most of us have, we got to go home. We've got other things to do. We've got other objectives. We have other motivations. And I mentioned in one of the slides, like the key for the personal learning is motivation. Motivation, motivation, motivation. Now, how do I get them motivated? And that's what I mean to bridging that gap, Frank, that I was talking about, this chasm. You're already going to find those catalysts. You will find those motivated individuals. Can you empower them? Can you unite them? Can you give them the right tools, the right frameworks to work together? Do they start showing actually results? The rest of the people will be like, oh, that looks kind of interesting. I want to do that too. And then that's where the actual real democratization happens.
I think that's a good point. Sorry, Alan. I was just thinking because your example, you went to the treasury, and I wonder how, in your experiences, how many organizations are thinking too far, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, big breakthrough innovations versus saying we have these catalysts throughout our organization. What if we can get these cross-functional teams even doing incremental innovation to build that muscle and tell us about it? Do you think what are your thoughts there around companies that fail to incrementally innovate to build the muscle as opposed to always just going for moonshots?
Well, CEOs are selling that their entire company can run marathons when half of them can't even walk. And that's going to Julian's point on the chat, by the way. It's like, and by the way, not all of us want to run marathons, and that's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. Some of us don't want to do it. That's not our interest, and that's okay. We need those people too, by the way. Again, this is not a good versus bad. Not all of us have to love the gym. That's okay. But again, find the ones that do, and then allow the people who don't like it to find their space in this new environment. But again, these moonshots is again promising and over-promising and under-delivering. How many of these corporate innovation labs have actually succeeded? Handful, guys.
Oh, yeah. Agreed.
It's a handful. But again, it's just unless you completely spin it out. And there's other ways of doing that, by the way. There's, creating new ventures, there's venture build, there's all sorts of other mechanisms. But the original idea of let's create this little lab where we put a bunch of crazy people and they come up with great ideas and then we try to bring them back into the organization, that's not been very successful.
Mm-hmm. Before we get back to Frank, Julian, did you want to unpack this question and take yourself off mute, or was it addressed for you?
I'd love to follow up on Julie's point.
Go ahead, Frank.
Julian's point, because I think he's right on topic there. This is brilliant, and I'm thinking, there's a problem in the top of the hierarchy. Leaders are just not good enough at decentralizing, inviting people in, opening up the strategy process, reducing their salaries, making a community. And what's going on?
Well, shareholders don't pay for that. No, I'm serious. I'm not pushing socialist agendas here either, by the way. Again, that's not what they're being paid for. They're being paid to 10% growth year on year. That's their number one. And everything they've been doing is actually, they're chasing that carrot. That's the environment we live in. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been others that actually succeeded in doing so, by the way. Again, it's a misalignment of you can do it. You can do both. It's just, it's hard. And now also opening, by the way, Frank, opening the strategy to everybody, it sounds wonderful and romantic. It's a freaking pain in the ass. I've got 30 employees. I do not want to be discussing with the intern. Yes, it's nice and including, but it's still really, really freaking hard. So there's a little, we need to find a balance between those two things. Now, can they do better? Yes. We also need to be realistic. And then I had this case where I was sitting in one of top engineering companies in Germany. Okay. I was invited to meet the CEO with our CEO of Allianz and a couple of their board members to explain what blockchain was. True story. Okay. And the first thing I said is, well, are you familiar with Google Docs? And I see blank space, like nobody knew what I was talking about. And again, to be perfectly honest, this is a room of 50 plus white men sitting around a table. That's the reality we live in, okay? And nobody had ever heard of Google Docs. I'm like, okay, forget about that. Have you heard of a Dropbox? Blank. Because again, if I was doing this online, by the way, I keep on talking about Dropbox and you would be like, oh, I don't know what that is about, but yeah, sure, this is not for me. One guy's like, it's something for pictures, right? Now, the first reaction is kind of shock. Are you freaking kidding me? The leader of one of the largest engineering companies in Germany does not know what Google Docs is? That doesn't talk very well about our digital future. But you also have to consider whoever is the CEO of that company has been there for probably 30 years, has built a career, a long, long career. He's probably a fantastic engineer, by the way. But for the last 20 years, he's not been in engineering. Then for the last 10 years, he's had an executive assistant. He's had basically VIP IT services. This guy rarely opens emails himself. He doesn't have to deal with this stuff. If our IT systems are crap, he doesn't know about it. And then you add to that, in his mind, a good weekend is not going on Facebook or LinkedIn or anything. He's probably biking, or it's also a different generation. This guy doesn't want to do anything digital when he's on his weekend. Because you think like, oh, I learned about Instagram on my weekend. Why am I going to fiddle with my phone? So it's a different generation. Now, what we're doing really, really wrong from a younger generation is communicating and showing the value to that generation. We have a gap. And again, what's our job as innovators? To be able to translate properly. Because once I managed to properly explain what blockchain was and how it was working, they were like, we want to do this. Yes. And then we got the treasury thing going. But we needed to be able to make them understand what the hell we were talking about. And we just assume too much as innovators that everybody understands what the hell we're talking about. And that's our number one mistake. Communication, which is not the same as information, by the way. Okay. So again, true story. And it's not for depressing anybody, just for the realization, hey, how can we do better?
I think that's actually, it's not depressing. It's like I said, it's reality. I think even if we take COVID as a prime example, we talk about how, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And these executives are shareholder value, and they've been burned before by the lure of soft skill training. And when COVID hit, these things like remote work, all of a sudden, digital transformation, automation, all got elevated because they were forced to. And I think that's one of the greatest impediments that you're talking about, is that the urgency hasn't hit there yet in organizations to develop the people the way you're talking about. So it's a massive impediment, and just it's kind of, you don't have to answer this because I think you did, but like, at what point does that urgency, that priority bubble up? I wanted to ask another question. It was about, this. I mean, obviously, I believe in all the stuff you're talking about, and the Sparkademy is amazing. But what role does government or society or education, whether it's post-secondary or even elementary and secondary school, play in this? Because we're still in that industrial age mindset of education early on in lives. So do you have an opinion on what role education plays in this? And curriculum?
And don't quote me on this, I'm being recorded. But so again, I sit at the board of the future of ETH Zurich, which is kind of like 40 years from now, what the university is going to look like. And I am the second youngest person on that board. I'm 36, by the way. Okay. And there was one younger person than me. Honestly, by the time this future of education thing happens, everybody in that committee is going to be dead. I'm not even saying retired. They're going to be dead. But these are the people they bring in to think about what the future of education looks like. There's a basic conceptual problem with how we're putting together these, and that's what happened. And then so I'll take that, and this is a public institution, so now I take that to government as a whole. We do have an issue with representation, but it's also an enormous challenge, Rocky. Touching elementary education, that's the most complicated, the most, you will be shot down from so many different directions wherever. You don't want to touch that with like, that's really, really scary, which is, again, that is depressing actually, because where we need that is actually where we need it the most, because what we're doing right now is actually fixing what the education system didn't manage to do to begin with. We're trying to patch things with Band-Aids where education system failed to begin with. I believe we can get better, but we need to show those results. And as of today, the tools we have, digital education, etc., honestly has not shown the results we have. Out of the $5 trillion US dollar global education market, I think only 3 to 5% of it is digital, actually. That just shows a huge opportunity, but also shows we're so far from actually showing anything that's more effective than what we had Industrial Revolution style. So yes, it needs to change, but to what? And we have same as corporate innovation. We haven't shown those basic low-hanging fruit, entry-level employee, hey, incremental innovation to show, hey, this is better. How many like fancy elementary schools buy these fancy whiteboards? Nobody uses them. Those are little Band-Aids, which again, we have not actually shown results because we don't have the research, because we're working on it. I think both Rocky and I are working on this. How can we, but we need to show those results. What's interesting about corporate education, by the way, is the context is controlled. We can actually play more, that we can learn. And then can we take those learnings and apply them towards our elementary, secondary education? That's my vision of what the future is going to look like. But as of today, we don't have the answers. I have no clue what a better elementary school is going to look like. Can it be better? Absolutely. How? And I don't want.
At least we have. At least we have some examples out there. I know Singapore for one, and there's some cases as well in Silicon Valley testing some. Yeah, exactly.
Number one, they need to pay teachers better. No, I'm serious. Yeah, number one problem: teachers are paid crap. Sorry, there's no teacher. This is a completely different conversation. But until we actually start appreciating the people who are teaching our children,
what I was going to say, the societal value that we place on education, right? For sure. So if you had other questions, throw them in the chat. We still have some few more minutes, but I know, Alan, for sure, I've been in the part of this Innov8rs community for a long time, and they all want data, like you said, and we don't have the data yet. But have you started to think about what kind of things we would measure? Like, how would we know, where are we on the spectrum? Or how do we know we've made it? How do we know we have a future-proofed organization with the skills we need to thrive? Have you started to think about those kind of data points yet?
So that's our goal. Again, I have an academic background, a PhD, and I'm working on Stefano's work. Why we're so passionate about what we're doing today is thinking of it from a scientific standpoint. Research into education is really, really bad. And again, this is not shaming anybody, but the problem is we don't have enough data. Research into education usually uses very small samples of students here and there, what you can actually extract from that because of legal complications. It's actually really, really hard to get good data into, is education effective? I'm sure all of you have heard about, I'm more of a visual learner and more of a, auditive learner and things like that. I'm not saying that's not true, but there's actual zero scientific evidence that is actually a thing. It sounds really, really intuitive, and most of us will be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. But there's actually no scientific, concrete scientific evidence that is actually a thing. You're not saying it's not true. I'm just saying we don't have the evidence for it because we don't have the data. Now, why am I excited about what we're doing now and what we can do now is because now we can actually track a lot more how people learn. So within our learner community, we're measuring their progress, like individually, how are these people learning? Where do they get stuck? Where do they advance faster? What type of activities they go? So we're collecting the data that hopefully, ideally in some future, not too far from now, will allow us to determine how do different people learn. Because Alan and Rocky want to learn the exact same thing, same concept. How Rocky learns and how Alan learns is different. We're different people. My question is, what's the most effective way for each of us to learn in our own way? That's where we need to aim for. And the data that we're collecting now, it's hopefully allowing us to start scratching the surface. The formula of effective learning has a lot of unknowns. Still too many unknowns. We're controlling for a lot of them today. That allows us to hopefully start plugging some holes. That's what we're aiming for, Rocky. And that's what we were really excited about this space.
Well, I think we're right up against the time. I think that's a great way to end and to summarize what Alan's been talking about is human skills matter. This is a lifelong journey. And just like most things in our lives, it's got to be hyper-personalized. So Alan, thank you so much for sharing this. Thank you everyone for joining. Share your thoughts. Hopefully you have access to the community platform. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this presentation. The video recording will be there if you wish to watch it again. If you have any questions, you can also put it on the community platform. And I believe there is another session coming up. And if there is, Kate, the link will be in the chat right now. So Alan, just some last words, but thank you so much for some really insightful information.
Thank you very much, Rocky. Thank you for moderating, and thank you everybody for your time and interest.